So, how to race an Ironman, or rather, how to finish an Ironman. Ironman is a very different race to the other triathlon distances where pacing and fueling are so incredibly important that they can be the difference between having a great day versus not actually finishing at all. I heard a saying the other day which was swim, overbike, walk. And it's so true, because the amount of people I know who've absolutely smashed the bike, got that amazing bike split, but then when you look at their marathon time, they're an hour and a half slower than you would have expected them to have been, and the second half of their run has been mostly walking. So pacing that bike split is incredibly important. The thing that you've really got to ask yourself is getting that sub 6 bike split or sub 5.5 hours or whatever you've got in your mind, is that more important than getting the best overall time you can? I would argue absolutely not, that you really need to think of an Ironman as one discipline rather than breaking it up into swim, bike, run, i.e. keep a nice even pace throughout, because if you smash the bike, the chances are your overall time is actually going to be worse than if you eased off a little bit on the bike and made sure that you're able to run properly. My coach said to me earlier this year that the swim is just the warm-up, the bike is the commute, and where your day is really going to unfold is on the run, and particularly the second half. And he even said the last 10k is where it really counts. And I have to say, I totally agree with that. I found that by going steady on the bike, although the run was tough, and particularly tough mentally for me, it meant that I was able to put together a run that I felt was not far off the best I could have done. So I'm going to split this up into swim, bike and run tips, and then nutrition, because I think nutrition and fueling are really that important. So the swim. The swim isn't really my area of expertise at all. I am not the best Ironman swimmer, so my two tips really are really for people like me and other adult onset swimmers. The first is to practice sighting a lot in training. You wouldn't believe how far off course some people could go. At Copenhagen, there were people around me drifting all over the place. And if you can't swim straight and if you can't sight properly, you're going to be a lot slower. You're going to swim a lot further and waste energy, and you could even get yourself into a bit of a panic if you find out you're miles off course. So definitely practice sighting in training and learn to get good at sighting if you can. My other big swim tip is to do plenty of open water swimming in training. Ideally, towards the end of your Ironman training block, in say the last 10 weeks, ideally try and do one open water swim per week. And if your open water swim in the race is in the sea, definitely do some sea swims. I did a long course weekend in July in Tenby, and the sea that day was pretty rough, pretty choppy. A lot of people only did one lap. And other people I know who did finish were being sick afterwards. So if your race day is in the sea and it could end up being rough like that, you don't want it to be the first time that you experience conditions like that. So try and do some sea swims in training if you are going to race in the sea. So in terms of the bike, my biggest tip is to get a power meter. If you're going to spend all this money on Ironman entries, hotels, flights possibly, etc., a power meter really isn't that big of an expense in terms of the grand scheme of things, and yet it could really be a huge difference in both your training and your race. The reason for this is that you basically train and race to specific power numbers, so you can make sure that you're not going to blow up on race day. What I would advise is that you do an FTP test. Just Google that. It's essentially 20 minutes as hard as you can go for the 20 minutes. From that, you'll get your average power number for the 20 minutes, and you work out 95% of that, and that is your FTP number. I would advise doing this on as flat a section of road as you can, with as few turns or interruptions as you can. So probably a good idea to try and do it early or late if you can. And if you're going to do that on a TT bike, if you're going to race on a TT bike, do the FTP test on the TT bike and in the aero position, because a lot of people find their power numbers are different in the aero position compared to on their road bikes. It's a good idea to do an FTP test like that several times during your training, in case your bike power changes over time. Then in terms of your training long rides, and in terms of the actual race effort, most people should be training and racing to around 65 to 75% of their FTP. For less experienced cyclists or slower cyclists, probably the lower end of that. But if you've done Ironman races before and you know what you're doing, you can be at the top end of that. But you really want the bike to feel easy, and particularly the first half to feel easy. You've got to stick to your numbers, race your race. Don't get caught up racing other people when you get overtaken. You're going to find, if you're sticking to your numbers, that you get overtaken by other people, especially in the early stages. It is quite hard to put your ego in a box and just let them. But what you'll probably find is in the second half of the bike, you'll be overtaking them, and you may see them on the run looking pretty sorry for themselves, because as I said before, smash that bike and you're going to be having a hard day. As I said before, the bike really is the commute to get to the run. It should not feel like you're working hard, and on the hills you really ought to be capping your power to 85 or 95% of your FTP. If you find you're going above your FTP on the hills, you really are going too hard. You'll see lots of people smashing themselves up the hills and attacking them, but that really isn't what you should be doing, because that's just the quickest way to smash your legs and then regret it later. About half of your race is going to be on the bike, so you can't really stress how important the bike is to an Ironman. It's where you're going to get the bulk of your nutrition and hydration in during the race, so you need to practice that in training, and you need to be doing quite a lot of 5 and 6 hour rides in training to build that base and to get used to being on a saddle for that long, because it's not always the most pleasant, but if you do it enough in training, it's going to be that much easier on race day. So on to nutrition then. People call nutrition and fueling the fourth discipline of Ironman, and it really is that important. Get it right and it will set you up for a great race. Get it wrong and that could lead to bonking, cramps, vomiting, and even diarrhea and several toilet stops. And in the worst case, it can be medical tent and DNF. So my biggest tip for this is practice, practice, practice. On all of your long rides and your long runs, you need to be practicing your fueling and fine-tuning it. You need to be using the stuff that you're going to use on race day. The old adage of never try anything new on race day is incredibly true. So make sure you get it right in training. A great resource is the website of Precision Fuel and Hydration. You don't have to buy their products, although I love their carb mix for my bike bottles, but they've got good online questionnaires for both sweat testing and sodium needs, and then also for fueling. Most people are going to need somewhere between 60 and 90 grams of carbs per hour during the race, but different people will have different requirements, so you need to practice and training for you. I used to get bad quad cramps when I did long rides, and so eventually I discovered I needed to be taking in more sodium. So by using that online sweat test, I started using carb mixers that had a higher concentration of sodium in, and then also took extra salt tabs with me, and I didn't get any cramps at Copenhagen at all, so that worked really well for me. But the key is to practice everything in training. Onto the run then, the final discipline. You're probably going to be feeling pretty chuffed at this point that the bike is over now. You can finally get off that saddle. Your legs are probably going to be turning over a little bit too fast at the beginning because they're used to the cadence of the bike. Just keep checking your watch in the early part of the first, 20 minutes, half an hour. Just make sure you're not going too fast so that you suffer later. My biggest run tip, and this was drilled into all of my coaching group by our coach who includes Kona qualifiers, was to use a 9-minute, 1-minute run walk method, or alternatively walk for a minute through each aid station. Really doesn't matter what you do, but the walk breaks are incredibly important to get your heart rate down, to reset and give your tendons a bit of a rest, and just to make sure really that you don't blow up. Our coach used to go on all the time about how people who try and run the whole thing will often get to about the halfway stage and then blow up and spend the second half of the run walking. And that certainly looked to be the case for a lot of people, and I certainly know a lot of people who've done Ironmans who've done exactly that. So I would heavily recommend the 9-1 run walk method. It does take a little while to get your head around, particularly in training. I hated doing it at first because just my ego couldn't handle taking walk breaks on training runs. But eventually I got used to it, and to be honest, I found that my run walks on long runs of say 2.5 or 3 hours, they really weren't any slower than if I'd just run it constantly. So it isn't going to affect your speed very much, but on race day it could be the difference between being able to run throughout the marathon or having a pretty tough end to the marathon. The other thing is to make sure you keep your nutrition and fueling going right from the start of the run. A lot of people tend to find towards the end of the run that their bodies don't want to take in gels or energy drinks anymore. Doesn't necessarily mean you're going to be sick, but you've just consumed too much sugar throughout the day. On both the Ironmans that I've done, that's been the case for me. So it's really important that you get your fueling in right from the start of the run in case that happens. And I would advise to be as self-sufficient as possible. I found out in training that I don't get on with Morton gels, which were the gels being handed out at Copenhagen. So I basically had 9 high five gels in my run bag and shoved them in my tri-suit pockets before the run, and basically had a gel every 3 miles. I would say the run walk method is also really good at just mentally breaking up the run. Because if you're looking at a watch and saying, right, okay, I'm going to walk now for a minute, you can focus on that instead of thinking about how far you've still got to go. It sounds crazy, but if the next mile is where you're going to have a gel, just mentally make that a bit of a treat to yourself, saying that, you know, I can have a gel when I get here. For me, it certainly did help break up that run. Anyway, that's about it. I hope this helps you. And I hope if you are about to do an Ironman that you have a great day, and that you have an awesome time. Thanks very much. Cheers. Bye bye.